Chapter 2. When one comes from nothing, there's nowhere to go but up. Hence, as I now stood before my glorious new home, I gaped in awe of a disaster. The cab driver had dumped my bags at my feet and fled to safer ground without ever asking for the fare. The house before me, utter perfection, more so than I had ever hoped. Wave after wave of emotion flooded me. So many memories from my youth when my parents were still living, and so many thoughts about how people viewed me because of where I came from. For years, if anyone had ever asked me about my childhood, I never said it was anything less than wonderful. How to explain those years, the wilds of a western ranch, and seldom leaving those acres and acres my parents owned? That land had more buildings falling down than standing. Settlers had once tried to farm that area long before my parents ever set eyes on it. My father, with loving hands, had rebuilt one tiny cabin for his bride, a love nest hidden away from the world where the two of them could grow old together. And then I came into the picture. I shot a gun and rode a horse before I ever walked. Or so the legend went. Oh, I'm well aware that I wasn't born in those olden times you read about in the Little House on the Prairie. But as certain as I'm standing, my parents raised me like I was. Our house, not much more than a miniature log cabin deep in the woods. No utilities, and almost everything made by hand. Faith and family were the end-all and be-all. My mother was a happy housewife, June Cleaver style. She baked fresh bread almost every morning in a wood stove. Plus, she made wonderful meals from scratch each day. She'd sit for hours in her rocking chair, knitting, sewing, whatever. Oh, and beside the cabin, having no running water, one couldn't ever spot a speck of dust anywhere. Nope, she found the time to clean that place from top to bottom every day. Beds were always made. Laundry tubs by the back door were in constant use, as was the clothesline in the yard. I have vivid memories of her humming as she worked, seeming to not have a care in the world. In addition, my mother was the hostess of more than a few women's committees for church, various Bible studies over the years. In all she did, she was polished and graceful as her mother had taught her. Didn't matter how she chose to live, she still had more than a touch of socialite still in her. Dresses and high heels didn't appear out of place in a log cabin when she wore them. They were part of who she was. My father was a woodsman. Yes, that's what it sounds like. He cut trees down and sold them. Simple as that. He'd be out in the forest all day, allowing my mother the space she needed to keep the perfect home. Before he left each morning, he'd make sure she had plenty of water and firewood for whatever chores she planned to do. She would make sure his jeans and flannel shirts didn't have any holes in them, and provided a jacket because it might rain or snow. She'd give him a passionate kiss, hand him his lunch pail, and wave until he was out of sight. Normal, send your man off to the office behavior. At night after dinner, they'd sit together by the fire, discussing scripture. They were a perfect match, holding hands as they whispered in each other's ears in their rocking chairs side by side. Pure bliss, and I never once saw them argue about anything. There were whispers of why we lived as we did. Amish, Mennonite, hippies who refused to change with the times. In the end, the why didn't matter. This was what made my parents happy, being one with the land, being one in body and spirit, and having nothing to worry about. Each day would begin with a prayer of thanks to the Lord for the blessing of life, and each evening would end with a prayer of thanks for another day well lived. So yes, I often hunted, fished, chopped wood, baked bread, knitted, and did whatever other chores were needed. Some days I became my mother's helper. Others I would follow my father around the property. This was our family. But I had a side that didn't connect with our home life. A part of me craved knowledge of all those things beyond my tiny world. Therefore, I read every book anyone put into my hands, by candlelight more often than not. Science, math, history, foreign lands, you name it, I learned it all. My local library in town up the road had to borrow books far and wide to quench my thirst for information back then. My big adventures to the great beyond fueled part of this desire. Every few years, my parents sent me to visit my grandparents back east. Both sets lived in the same area, almost neighbors, but everyone agreed I would be more comfortable at that summer cabin that belonged to my grandparents on my mother's side. To me, it was a mansion, a rambling place in the countryside with more rooms than I could count. Thus I never did see the city they lived in, not even once. Fine by me. The summer home was overwhelming enough. Grandparents, cousins, aunts, uncles, distant relatives would float in and out during my brief stays. I never did try to keep track of them all. My grandparents on my father's side died when I was rather young. I don't remember them much, to be honest. All those people from the other side of the country almost didn't feel like a part of my life. No, they were more of an obligation I had to fulfill to keep my parents happy. However, during those trips, I learned my mother and her mother were two peas in a pod. They looked alike, acted alike, and dressed alike. But my grandmother made it clear she didn't agree with my mother's choice of lifestyle. She'd whisper things to me like, "You're going to end up with nothing, honey." Or she'd hint, "You don't want to be treated like trash, do you?" Or she'd say, "You need to learn to be a proper lady." As a child, I didn't quite understand her words, yet I could see she didn't treat me the same as her other grandchildren. My grandmother always placed me at the end of the table and served me last. Okay, I'm sure part of this was my fault. I played just as hard while there as I did at home, and her maid had a difficult time getting me cleaned up before dinner. At home, until I became a teenager, I only had to wear a dress for church. The rest of the time, my mother allowed me to wear my dirty jeans and ripped t-shirts. On the other hand, at my grandmother's, I had to wear a dress for dinner. And heaven help me if I spilled one drop of liquid or one crumb on the dumb thing while I ate. And during the day, my grandmother wanted me to wear slacks and a blouse, which couldn't ever have a speck of dirt on them. Not so easy to do while riding a horse or climbing a tree or whatever mischief I got up to while I visited the summer cabin, a place where I quickly learned it was better to spend time with the paid help than the relatives. My grandmother often questioned me about my mother, asking about things I couldn't answer. Once she asked if my mother still played the piano. I shrugged and didn't give any reply. I'd never once seen my mother anywhere near a musical instrument, much less play one. Strangely, my grandmother never once mentioned my father at all. To her, he didn't exist. One other thing I learned about family dynamics. My grandmother tolerated my other set of grandparents, but nothing more. The few times all my grandparents were at the same table for dinner, the room remained silent. Unless someone spoke with me, the remainder of the group shared nothing at all. Almost thankful that by the time I turned 10, only my grandmother on my mother's side remained living. So much easier that way. But she sold the cabin when I was 11, ending my visits. Do believe I did a little dance when I heard about that. Needless to say, my childhood was an interesting one. Whether for good or bad, I grew into a strong-willed young lady, sure and tough as any man. However, it wasn't enough to allow me to live my own life. Oh no. My father made it clear the only way off the ranch was through marriage. Our family followed the rules, my father being a rather strict man who believed everything the church told him. Every Sunday he took notes on this sermon and spent the next week memorizing them. He ended up becoming a walking hermeneutics textbook. Ask him any question about a Bible passage, and he'd be more than happy to give you a detailed lesson on it. Above all, my father made it clear that thoughts were as important as actions. He would often hold my hand in his as he looked up to the heavens. Never forget, the Bible says, "For as he thinks within himself, so he is." Your heart and mind must always be pure, honey. My mother had a different approach to gaining my conformity. Guilt. She was a master at making me feel shame over every little thing I did. I always made my skirts too short because they were hitting my kneecaps, not my calves. My neck showed because I'd ripped off the top button of my blouse. My fingernails were chipped and had dirt beneath them because I'd forgotten to use the file. Don't get me wrong, she wasn't mean, only making sure I stayed on the straight and very narrow path. As a child, I didn't mind the discipline, the firm hand keeping me deeply rooted in faith. I obeyed almost without question. I loved God above all else. I honored and obeyed my parents. I tried not to wish for things I didn't have. I vowed to be faithful to only one man when the time came. I went to church every time the doors were open. Sunday school, service, choir, youth group, you name it. I didn't lie, cheat, steal, or swear. Nevertheless, the more I read and studied, the more I wanted to see what else was out there to be explored. No matter how much I loved our little corner of the woods, it wasn't enough to satisfy me. And this, I discovered from my parents, borderline coveted what my neighbors had. So it was wrong. Yet still I hungered for more. My father warned me this was treading on a very dangerous path. Simple was better. I persisted in my desire to be on my own, but my father didn't agree. Out there was way too dangerous for a single woman, for a woman must be pure in all things. The job of a husband, on the other hand, was to make sure she stayed in that state of purity at all times. Women were nothing but helpmates, created to follow behind their men. My mother was a prime example of this. She never did anything but follow a step behind my father while she provided a cozy home for him. Consequently, at the beginning of the summer I turned 18, I stood at the altar, saying my vows to a boy I'd seen only once before. He was but a few years older than me, new in town from somewhere out in the great big world, or probably only the next county over. My parents had said he was a fitting match. I didn't disagree, because who he was didn't matter. What he was did. All I needed was a warm, breathing male to spring me out of my prison. Oh, I'm well aware I'm being way too dramatic about this. My parents' cozy home wasn't as bad as all of that. They did allow me to drive the 10 miles into town almost any time I wanted. Still, every baby bird needs to leave the nest and fly away, build something for themselves. But problems between my new husband and I began from the start. And I'm not talking about the beginning of the marriage. Nope, I'm talking from the moment of our engagement, when he dictated all the terms of our future marriage in about 10 seconds flat. I walked into the little DQ that evening with its bright orange and pink decor and went straight to the only person in the place sitting alone. His dark hair cut short, not a hint of a 5 o'clock shadow on his face. He wore a bright white polo shirt and khakis. On the table, a basket of French fries and a cup of chocolate ice cream. I put out my hand. Hi, I'm Amy, and you must be Tom, right? Hey, babe. This thing's got to be done quick, like next week. I've got to head out of town again for, stuff, work. Yeah, you know. He looked over his shoulder and out the window. So I don't care if it's all fancy or anything. The church should be free. Hold up. I met this guy a minute ago, and he wants to get married in a week. No preamble, no introduction, nothing. Kind of short notice. Don't we want to wait a bit? Maybe have a few more dates? His eyes were still staring outside. For the life of me, I couldn't figure out why. No point. This is meant to be, dear. His head did a slow crawl back towards the center of the room, but his eyes still weren't focusing on me. He grabbed a fry, dipped it in the ice cream, and munched on it. Oh, and I bunk with some buddies when I'm in town. You know, a place where we can live? Nothing fancy. I'm not here much. I travel all the time, don't you know? I put my elbows on the table, my chin in my hands, and gazed at the man who'd been picked out for me. Well, my parents decided to get married after sharing a single cup of coffee. Who was I to argue with what God wanted for my life? I can find one. I tried to look into his eyes. However, they were now pointed up towards the air vent. Oh, and we can't have a honeymoon. I can't get time off from, work. Right. I just started. You know, I'll find us a motel for the night in another town near here. He tapped on the table with the ice cream cup. A glop plopped over the side, splashing onto the surface. He swirled his finger into it, making a wide mess. He played with the ice cream for a while. Was he trying to paint with it? Odd, but I was aware some people play with food, just not in public. On and on Tom went as we sat across each other at the local DQ, becoming engaged over French fries dipped in chocolate ice cream. Weird didn't go far enough to describe the occasion, and it terrified me to speak up against the whole thing. Didn't matter the impression of how forced and rushed the whole thing appeared to be, because all I needed to do to become an adult was to be married. Rules were made to be followed.